In 1869, the territory of Wyoming passed the first law that would grant women the right to vote in the United States. Wyoming's first territorial governor, John Campbell, signed the original Women's Suffrage Act after much deliberation. However, just 2 years later, both the Wyoming House of Representatives and the Wyoming Council, the two legislative branches of the territory, voted in favor of repealing the Suffrage Act. Governor Campbell vetoed this attempted repeal and gave a speech declaring his support of both the Suffrage Act and the women of Wyoming. Quote, "There is upon our statute book an act granting to the women of Wyoming Territory the right of suffrage and to hold office, which has now been enforced 2 years. Under its liberal provisions, women have voted in the territory, served on juries, and held office. It is simple justice to say that the women entering for the first time in the history of the country upon these new and untried duties have conducted themselves with as much tact, sound judgment, and good sense as the men." While it would be claiming more than the facts justify to say that this experiment in a limited field has demonstrated beyond a doubt the perfect fitness of women at all times and under all circumstances for taking apart the government, it furnishes at least responsible presumptive evidence in her favor, and she has a right to claim that, so long as none but good results are made manifest, the law should remain unrepealed. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds Podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which, in many cases, can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we looked at the South Pass City Gold Rush and a resident of South Pass City, Esther Hobart Morris. Esther Morris was not just a key figure in South Pass City, but is also credited as a key contributor of the passage of the Women's Suffrage Act in Wyoming. This episode will talk more about not only Esther Morris, but the women's suffrage movement in Wyoming at the time. This episode is also a particularly special episode as we are joined by a guest speaker today. Sophie, why don't you introduce yourself?
My name is Sophie Barksdale. I'm an Australian filmmaker. I live in Lander, Wyoming, and I've been here for 8 years. And I was lucky enough to co-produce a film called The State of Equality with Caldera Productions in partnership with Wyoming PBS on women's suffrage. And the film was released for the 150th anniversary of women's suffrage in Wyoming, which was a really exciting film to work on.
And what did working as a producer on these documentaries look like?
So as a producer, you are very much liaising with the historians, reading and getting up to scratch on the history yourself, helping write interview questions, scheduling crew, booking hotels, getting our interview subjects in the right place at the right time, being part of crafting the story. So once we've got all the interviews recorded, we sit together with the director. So Jeff O'Gara was the director on this film. And we sat in the edit suite here in Riverton at Wyoming PBS, which is housed at CWC, and Kyle Nikoloff was our editor and main director of photography. He was our main videographer, and which always helps when he's also the same person who's editing, because he already knows the footage. And yeah, crafting the story, arguing for, we need to put more of this in, or we may need to do less of this, or I think this person says this better. Yeah, helping to craft the story and the edit, and it was wonderful to learn all this Wyoming history.
So set the stage for us following the Civil War. What does America look like? What does Wyoming look like? And what does the suffrage movement look like?
So the Civil War ends in 1865, and the Wyoming Territory is formed in 1868. Before 68, people are just coming through Wyoming. They are not settling. Wyoming is not Wyoming. It is just part of another territory, and the Oregon Trail. People are coming through on the 2-track trail to get to the West Coast. And it's not until gold is found that they start moving here. So around 1867, 1868, they find gold in South Pass City. And so then hundreds and thousands of people move here. And we're looking at a really diverse mix of people moving here. We have Chinese immigrants. We have African Americans coming here to work in livery stables and general stores. We have ex-Union soldiers moving here. We have the other side, ex-soldiers moving here. And so there is a huge amount of people with different backgrounds, different education levels, all in this sort of melting pot that is South Pass City. They build many saloons, and people move here to stay. There's a huge amount of anti-black sentiment in South Pass City. Remembering that we are just coming out of the Civil War. And so there's strong feelings on both sides there.
So you mentioned that they built many saloons in South Pass City, and one of the saloon keepers there was a William H. Bright. William Bright was the one who proposed the act to grant women the right to vote for the first time in Wyoming, and years later he said he introduced the Suffrage Act because he believed that his wife was, quote, as good as any man and better than convicts and idiots. And on November 30th, 1869, at the First Territorial Legislative Assembly in Wyoming, William Bright does propose the Suffrage Act, and it's passed in the Wyoming Council. In the Wyoming House of Representatives, however, it's faced with much more opposition. The main opponent of the Suffrage Act was led by Ben Sheeks, who was a lawyer and who was also from South Pass City. Sheeks initially tried to delay the passage of the bill by requesting recesses and postponing when they would hold a vote, or, provided that the bill was to be passed, he proposed it would not immediately go into effect. When all of these tactics had failed, Sheeks then tried to modify the bill in order to make it more palatable to his own taste. He first proposed an amendment that would disallow Black women and Native American women from voting, although this modification was rejected. His next proposal requested that they reword ladies to women in the bill, and this much less ambitious change was accepted by the legislature. His final goal was to then raise the voting age for women in the act from 18 years to 21 years of age, and this too was accepted. The amendments were adopted and then passed in the House with a vote of 7-4, with Sheeks still voting against it. And on December 6th, 1869, at 8:20 p.m., the bill was given to Governor Campbell to sign. Now, Campbell had 3 choices in his mind. First, he could veto the bill, and this is what the Democratic legislature expected him to do, as he was a Republican appointment. This would allow the Democrats to say that they had tried to pass the bill and would give them the moral high ground and the moral victory in doing so without actually having to grant women the right to vote. Campbell could also choose to actually sign the bill, thus putting it into law and granting women the right to vote. And his final option was to not do anything, at which point it would automatically become a law after enough time had passed, without him actually needing to approve it. but he didn't really consider this option as he thought it was cowardly. After several days of deliberation, on the evening of December 10th and the last day of the assembly for the legislative session, Governor Campbell, in fact, does sign the bill. He later explained that he approved the act not because he believed it was the right thing to do, but because he was unable to convince himself that it was the wrong thing to do. So, for the first time in the United States, women had been granted the right to vote. Though it was not an official state yet, Wyoming's territorial status did help make the passage of women's suffrage easier. As a territory, all that they needed was a majority in both the House of Representatives and the Council, which they got, as well as the signature of the governor, which they also got. In many of the states back east, additional hurdles existed for sweeping legislation like women's suffrage, which, an example is mandating a popular vote among the populace, where 50% of public votes are needed to pass this Suffrage Act. So that's a bit about the passage of the Suffrage Act, and I know we talked a bit about her in the previous episode, but do you mind talking a bit about Esther Hobart Morris some more?
The most famous woman from South Park City who we still remember and hold dear is Esther Hobart Morris. She was the first woman in the country to be appointed as a judge. She was appointed in February of 1870, and she only served for 9 months. She was born in New York State and was orphaned at 14 and worked as a milliner until she was 28. Then she marries a guy who's a civil engineer. They have a son, and then her husband dies. So then she moves to Illinois, meets and marries John Morris. They have twin boys, which I was excited by because I'm a twin. And then in 1868, they hear about the gold, and John Morris and her young son move to South Park City, where John Morris opens a saloon. And then shortly after, in June, so 6 months later, in June of 1869, Esther Hobart Morris follows with the twins. She is remembered as being big of stature. According to T.A. Larson, at the time she was 56, she weighed 180 pounds and stood almost 6 feet tall. And Grace Hebert describes her as heroic in size and masculine in mind.
So, what sort of role did Esther Morris play in the passage of the Suffrage Act?
So, we know she and her twin sons were all firm believers in women's suffrage, but there's not a huge record of her being active in local women's suffrage organizations before she moves to South Park City. She and her husband have a difficult relationship. Rumor has it he was an alcoholic. There might have been domestic violence involved, and because of this, she moves in 1870 with her son Edward to Laramie and then later to Cheyenne. But before that, she becomes the Justice of the Peace in South Park City and becomes that first woman. And she has been credited throughout Wyoming as being the mother of women's suffrage and having a great deal to do with the passage of the Female Suffrage Act. I would say we don't have a lot of evidence to support that. She was supportive of Bright in his championing of women's suffrage. She did attend national suffrage conventions later in her life, but she was not really an activist, and she never, during her lifetime, claimed any involvement in the passage of the suffrage bill. So I think any claim towards that comes outside of her is maybe wishful thinking. In a letter written in 1871 that is read at a women's suffrage convention in Washington, D.C., she very clearly gives William Bright the credit for introducing women's suffrage. She says, so far as women's suffrage has progressed in this territory, we are entirely indebted to men. To William H. Bright belongs the honour of presenting the Women's Suffrage Bill, and it was our district judge, the Honourable John W. Kingham, who proposed my appointment as the Justice of the Peace and the trial of women as jurors. Circumstances has transpired to make my position as a Justice of the Peace a test of women's ability to hold public office, and I feel that my work has been satisfactory, although I have often regretted that I was not better qualified to fill the position. Like all pioneers, I have laboured more in faith and hope, which I love that last quote. So she becomes the first woman in the country to be a woman judge. It takes another 111 years for a woman to be appointed in Wyoming as a statewide district court judge. So we trailblaze, and then we rest on our laurels. But Wyoming hasn't forgotten Esther Hobart Morris. In 1963, a statue of Esther as Mother Morris was erected in front of the state capitol in Cheyenne, and then 3 years after that, one has been contributed to the National Statuary Hall in the Capitol in Washington. Each state is allowed to place 2 statues, and so one of ours is Esther Hobart Morris. She is just one of 9 women represented in that collection in Washington. And one of our scholars said Morris, as she was during her pioneer days in Wyoming, surrounded mostly by men.
Okay, so when the Suffrage Act is finally passed, what sort of issues arise out of it?
Yeah, so the first vote held in South Park City, there was a riot almost. So the Congress was controlled by Republicans, which is closer to what our Democrats are today, which I'm not sure if many people know that. The Democrats were more like the Republicans. We've had a switch somehow. So Congress was controlled by the Republicans, and they passed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guarantee former male slaves could be citizens. They're protected by the law like everybody else. And then the 15th Amendment guarantees that they can't be denied the right to vote based on their color or the fact that they'd once been slaves. So these amendments are ratified, approved by the territories, and become law. And so in the first election in South Park City, candidates who are trying to get people to vote for them, they're handing out whiskey, there's drunk miners in the streets, and these group of ex-slaves are coming down the street to vote. And there's this riot. The miners are armed with knives and guns, and the territorial sheriff had heard there would be a bit of a racket and had rode up here, and so rode in front of the ex-slaves to get them to the voting box to enable them to vote. But it was pretty rowdy at the time, and the Honourable John Kingman, who was of the Wyoming Supreme Court at the time, called it pandemonium. But the African Americans were able to cast their vote, and there's no record of anyone being killed that day, but I'm sure it was a nervous moment for a lot of people. So I think that really shows that when Wyoming's suffrage movement comes, there's that anti-black sentiment trickling into those reasons why.
There's lots of discussion about why the Suffrage Act was passed, and especially at the time of its passage, many of the legislators returned home from the Legislative Assembly and had to explain to their primarily male constituents why they granted women the right to vote. A popular story at the time was that it was just a joke played by the legislators, and they never actually intended for it to get passed, though there is very little. Actually, there's no evidence to support this other than 1 or 2 newspapers mentioning this at the time. A more commonly accepted theory is that it was just a publicity stunt in order to draw not only single women, but also women and their families to the West. It's also possible that William Bright, the legislator who initially proposed the Suffrage Act, simply thought it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think those two things can be true at the same time. I mean, I think William Bright has proven that he believed strongly in women's suffrage and that it was the right thing to do. He leaves Wyoming and he and his wife move to Colorado, and they become very vocal in the Colorado suffrage movement after their time here in Wyoming. So we know he and his wife care very deeply about women's suffrage and the women's rights movement. But the discussion of was this a publicity stunt? Are we trying to raise awareness of the Wyoming territories to bring more women to Wyoming? I mean, I think that can be true too. We have to remember that in a mining town, it's predominantly men, and it was predominantly single men who moved here in the late 1800s. So they're looking to up the women population for sure. So I think, yeah, both of those things can be true.
Okay, so women are granted the right to vote, and yet at the next legislative assembly, the legislators there attempt to repeal the Suffrage Act.
The repeal, so 2 years after the Wyoming Territory gives women the right to vote, legislature repeals. And thankfully, the governor, Campbell, vetoes that repeal. The reason that the legislators were attempting to repeal, I think they assumed that women would vote alongside their husbands. They assumed that women would vote the same. It would be a household vote, but it would just be adding the numbers. And Wyoming didn't have a secret ballot until 1890, so they could see where women were voting. And it was observed that women were voting for Republican representatives, and the Democrats were not pleased with that. And it was a predominantly Democratic legislature. But after the women voted, there were some Republicans sitting in the Wyoming Territories legislature. I think, too, at the time, the women's movement becomes quite closely tied to the Prohibition movement. There's the women's temperance movement, and they were trying to close down saloons. A lot of these legislators owned saloons, so not happy about that either. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the women's temperance movement in sort of the context of, again, not having any steps in domestic strife situations. And this closing down saloons so your husband's not coming home rolling drunk and becoming violent seemed to be one of the only steps that women could take. So in 1873, the temperance movement successfully led a campaign to close saloons in Ohio. And I think Wyoming is watching that. And, you know, the temperance movement is one of the first groups in America to campaign against family violence publicly. That was not the done thing, you know. What happens behind closed doors stays behind closed doors. But in that time, there is just no recourse. And so the temperance movement was incredibly popular. They were doing prohibition work, they were doing missionary work, and these legislators were not happy it was going to affect their business. It was certainly affecting the sort of social setting in Wyoming, and they didn't like it. But thankfully, Governor Campbell repealed. He had the same standards he had 2 years earlier, and I'm so grateful that he did.
Well, thank you very much for coming today and talking about the Suffrage Act with us. I did want to briefly conclude with a passage that comes from Solving the Jigsaw Puzzle, One Suffrage Story at a Time by Sidney Howell Fleming, and it reads, quote, "When Wyoming entered the Union, the men and women who had proposed planning a part of the program independently, and did, planned a celebration. No longer a resident of Wyoming, Bright did not stand on the stage that celebrated the event, nor share the glory for his original decision. The women of Cheyenne chose 4 women for public honors, 2 of whom Bright had credited with energetic advocacy many years before. Morris was to give the flag, the gift of the women of Wyoming, and Post was to accept the Constitution that provided for women's suffrage and included a declaration of political equality. Bright's contribution was one, a stellar and key one, but only one, of many contributions by Wyoming men and women whose ideas and actions brought Wyoming to try a new order of things and to wear the name Equality State." That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode will focus on A Legend of the West, Butch Cassidy. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. For more information, visit their website, windriverccf.com.